Sarah never believed in ghosts until she inherited her grandmother's Victorian mansion. The sprawling estate had stood empty for 5 years since her grandmother's passing, its rooms collecting dust and shadows. But it was the music room that drew her attention from the moment she stepped inside. The grand piano sat silent in the corner, its ivory keys yellowed with age. Sarah remembered her grandmother playing it when she was young, filling the house with melodious classical pieces. Now, the room felt different, heavy with an unseen presence that made the hair on her neck stand up. It started on her third night in the house. Sarah was unpacking boxes in the study when she heard it, the soft, unmistakable sound of piano keys being struck. The notes drifted through the halls, playing her grandmother's favorite nocturne. Her heart racing, Sarah crept toward the music room. The melody grew louder as she approached, but when she pushed open the heavy wooden door, the room was empty. The piano sat untouched, its lid closed. The music stopped the moment she entered, leaving behind an oppressive silence. That night marked the beginning of increasingly strange occurrences. Every evening at exactly 9:47 p.m., the piano would play the same haunting melody. Sarah tried recording it, setting up cameras, even having the piano removed, but nothing stopped the phantom music. Local historians revealed that before her grandmother's time, the house belonged to a renowned pianist named Eleanor Vale. In 1912, Eleanor had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only a letter speaking of music that echoes through time. Her body was never found. Sarah began researching Eleanor's history obsessively. She discovered that Eleanor had been working on an original composition before she vanished, one that was never completed. The melody that played each night was just a fragment, ending abruptly in the middle of a phrase. One evening, Sarah decided to face her fears. She sat at the piano just before 9:47 p.m. and waited. When the ghostly music began, she placed her hands on the keys and started playing along. The unseen presence seemed to respond, the melody shifting slightly to accommodate her additions. Together, Sarah and the ghost of Eleanor Vale completed the unfinished piece. As the final notes faded away, Sarah felt a cold touch on her shoulder and heard a whispered, "Thank you." The room grew warmer, lighter, as if a heavy weight had lifted. The phantom music never played again after that night. But sometimes, when Sarah sits at the piano, she swears she can feel Eleanor's presence guiding her hands across the keys, two musicians separated by time but united through their love of music. Eleanor's story became a local legend, and Sarah eventually turned the music room into a small museum dedicated to the pianist's memory. Visitors often report hearing faint melodies when no one is playing, and some claim to see a woman in Victorian dress sitting at the piano, her fingers dancing across the keys as she plays her completed masterpiece for all eternity. Sarah never moved out of the house, feeling a deep connection to both her grandmother and Eleanor. She learned to embrace the supernatural aspects of her home, understanding that some bonds, whether through family or music, transcend even death itself. David took the security guard position at Oakwood Memorial Hospital because it paid well and seemed easy enough: monitor the cameras, make hourly rounds, report any disturbances. The fact that the hospital had been abandoned for 15 years didn't bother him. At least, not at first. The job listing hadn't mentioned why the hospital closed: a tragic fire in the psychiatric ward that claimed 27 lives. The building had been deemed structurally sound afterward, but no one wanted to reopen it. Now it stood as a hollow shell, its empty corridors still bearing scorch marks from that fateful night. David's first few shifts were uneventful. He'd walk the darkened halls with his flashlight, checking for signs of vandalism or break-ins. The old hospital creaked and groaned, but that was normal for a building its age. He told himself the whispers he sometimes heard were just the wind whistling through broken windows. Everything changed during his fourth week. While making his rounds, David noticed something odd on the security monitors: a figure in a hospital gown, walking slowly down the corridor of the former psychiatric ward. Thinking it was an intruder, he rushed to investigate. The figure had vanished by the time he reached the ward, but the air felt different, heavy and cold, with an acrid smell like smoke. As David swept his flashlight across the hallway, the beam caught something that made his blood run cold: fresh footprints in the dust, leading to a locked door. That door shouldn't have been locked. All interior doors were supposed to remain unlocked for fire safety. Yet when David tried his master key, it wouldn't turn. From behind the door came sounds of muffled crying, followed by what seemed like multiple voices speaking in urgent whispers. David called for backup, but by the time his supervisor arrived, the door was unlocked and the room was empty. The only evidence something had been there were the footprints, which ended abruptly in the middle of the room. Over the next few months, the incidents escalated. Security cameras would catch glimpses of patients in hospital gowns, doctors in outdated uniforms, and nurses pushing empty wheelchairs. The apparitions never appeared on the same cameras twice, and no physical evidence was ever found. The breaking point came when David was checking the psychiatric ward one night. The temperature suddenly dropped, and he heard what sounded like dozens of people screaming. The smell of smoke became overwhelming, and through the darkness, he saw them, transparent figures running through the halls, their bodies flickering with phantom flames. Among them was a young woman in a hospital gown, her eyes wide with terror. Unlike the others, she stopped and looked directly at David. "Help us," she pleaded, her voice echoing as if from a great distance. "We're still trapped here. We can't find our way out." David stumbled backward, his heart pounding. The apparitions vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind only the lingering scent of smoke and a profound sense of sorrow. The next day, David began researching the fire. He discovered that many victims had been found in locked rooms, suggesting they had become trapped while trying to escape. The official investigation had never determined why so many doors had been locked that night. Working with local historians and paranormal investigators, David helped piece together the tragic events of the fire. They performed a ceremony to help the spirits find peace, acknowledging their pain and offering them a symbolic way out. The hauntings gradually decreased after that, though the hospital never felt truly empty again. David continued working there until his retirement, serving as both a security guard and an unofficial custodian of the spirit stories. Today, the hospital stands as a memorial to those lost in the fire. Visitors sometimes report seeing figures in hospital gowns walking the halls, but they no longer seem distressed, just echoes of the past, forever walking the corridors of their final resting place. The Black Rock Lighthouse stood like a lonely sentinel on its tiny island, marking dangerous shoals that had claimed countless ships over the centuries. Emma took the job as lighthouse keeper after her father disappeared during a storm 3 months earlier. The official report listed him as presumed drowned, but Emma knew there was more to the story. The night before he vanished, her father had called her in a panic, rambling about strange lights in the water and voices calling his name. Emma had dismissed it as stress from the isolation, but now, living in the lighthouse herself, she understood his fear. It began with small things, items moving on their own, footsteps on the spiral staircase when she was alone, the lighthouse beam occasionally flickering despite the backup generators working perfectly. But the true horror started when Emma found her father's old logbook. The final entries described something in the water, not just lights, but faces peering up from the depths, their features twisted in eternal screams. Her father wrote about a particular voice that kept calling to him, claiming to be his long-dead wife, Emma's mother. Emma had been too young to remember her mother's death, but she knew the story, a late-night swim that ended in tragedy, her body never recovered. Reading her father's accounts, Emma realized with growing dread that perhaps her mother's death wasn't as simple as it seemed. One stormy night, exactly 3 months after her father's disappearance, Emma saw them for herself. Faces in the waves, dozens of them, glowing with an otherworldly phosphorescence. Among them was her mother, looking exactly as she did in old photographs, and beside her, her father's face, now gaunt and hollow-eyed. They called to her, their voices carrying over the howling wind, begging her to join them in the depths. Emma watched in horror as more faces emerged, sailors, passengers, children, all victims of the treacherous waters around Blackrock. Fighting the urge to answer their calls, Emma barricaded herself in the lighthouse tower. As the storm raged outside, the spirits became more aggressive. They began materializing inside the lighthouse, their watery forms leaving puddles of seawater that moved against gravity, crawling up the walls and across the ceiling. Through her research, Emma discovered that Blackrock had a darker history than anyone knew. The original lighthouse keeper in 1849 had deliberately let ships crash on the rocks, then murdered any survivors. His actions had created a vortex of supernatural energy, trapping the souls of his victims and any others who died in these waters. The truth about her mother's death became clear. She had discovered this history and tried to expose it, only to fall victim to the vengeful spirits herself. Her father had likely met the same fate when he got too close to the truth. But Emma refused to surrender to the same darkness. During the next storm, she faced the spirits directly, standing at the lighthouse rail as they rose from the waves. She read aloud the names of every known victim, acknowledging their pain and offering them forgiveness. The spirits responded to her gesture. One by one, they began to fade, their tortured expressions softening as they finally found peace. Last to go were her parents, who smiled at her with pride before dissolving into sea spray. Today, Blackrock Lighthouse remains operational, though few are willing to serve as its keeper. Emma stayed on for 30 years, dedicating herself to maintaining both the light and the memories of those lost at sea. She documented everything she experienced, ensuring that the true history of Blackrock would never be forgotten. Visitors to the lighthouse often report seeing mysterious lights in the water during storms, but they no longer call out with malicious intent. Instead, they serve as an additional warning to ships, a supernatural complement to the lighthouse beam above, the spirits of the dead helping to prevent more souls from joining their ranks beneath the waves.